Hey, welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. I have a very special episode for you today. I'm going to be talking with Mike Joyce, who has a very distinguished career. Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard of him. But he's a chief audit executive. We'll get into some of that a little bit too. But he also served as the chair of the board for the Institute of Internal Auditors. So, a lot of great information, and we're going to get to that episode right now. Hi, I'm Jason Mefford, and you're in the right place to start transforming your career and life with this podcast. I've been in the trenches as an executive leader, and now I'm an executive coach and confidential advisor to executives all over the world. I use a multidisciplinary approach to improve learning that drives transformation by getting to the root cause in a practical, no-nonsense way. I love learning and sharing what makes people tick. You get both education and entertainment, since learning shouldn't be boring, right? But that's enough about me. This podcast is a combination of intuitive leadership, neural influence, and mental mastery to take your career and life to levels you've never thought possible. If you're wanting to improve yourself, develop stronger relationships professionally and personally, make quicker, better decisions, and become a more effective leader, then of course, this podcast is for you because you are going to learn how to manage emotions in yourself and others, avoid burnout, stress, and anxiety, master your mind, get people to listen and take action, and become a lifelong learner. And when you do that, you will have a positive mental attitude, executive leadership presence, and the skills to know exactly what to say and do in any situation. I'm glad you're here. So, let's get started. Well, hey, today I am talking with Mike Joyce. Mike, how you doing, man?
Doing great, Jason. Thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, I was excited, when because it's jamming with Jason. We're both actually are musicians. Now, you are a much better musician than I am. I'm a hack in comparison, but it was exciting because I know when you were chairman of the IIA, your theme was audit in tune, and you were kind of bringing in some musical kind of analogies and other stuff with it too, which I just loved, obviously. So I'm so excited, and I'm geeking out. Okay, talking to you today. So this is great. But maybe again, for people that have been living under a rock, do you want to just give kind of a brief background on your career, kind of how you got to where you're at today? Because you've got a position of a lot of responsibility in your organization. It's a big organization as well, and that's always kind of interesting for people to know, hey, if I want to be a chief audit executive someday, what's the path look like? What have other people done?
Sure. Well, and again, if I go too long or this is totally boring, just stop me. But I actually, which is hard for me to believe, began my internal audit career. It'll be 38 years this year with the J.C. Penney Company's internal audit department. I'm actually from Pittsburgh originally, so I started as a staff auditor, like most people would, in their Pittsburgh office. And to this day, I look back on the 12 years I'd spent with Penny's as just an incredible fortune on my part to have been with a group that provided such excellent training, mentorship, friendship. So many of those folks that I started with 38 years ago, I still keep in touch with today. And so while I was with Penny's, after being in the Pittsburgh office for a few years, I was promoted to the Philadelphia field office they had at the time. And about a year or so, I was then managing that group, which was responsible for auditing all of the JCPenney stores, basically along the East Coast, Northeast Coast. And so that was a great experience. Obviously, as many internal audit departments experience at that time, that was almost 80% travel, right, to get to the sites.
Yep.
Things have changed quite a bit since then. I was eventually moved then to the headquarters in Dallas, Texas for Penny's. Where another, I guess, thing that I say that Penny's provided to me is that I married one of my fellow auditors at Penny's. So,
And back then it was okay, but now,
yeah,
it's
Well, actually, we were in separate reporting chains, but 30 plus years later, she hasn't kicked me out yet. So that's another thing I can chalk up to JCPenney. But 30 years ago, after our kids started being born, we wanted to get closer to family. As I mentioned, I'm from Pittsburgh. My wife was actually from Chicago. So as luck would have it, an opportunity came up for me to move to Chicago in 1995 to become the director of audit for what was then a regional HMO here in Chicago, called Rush Prudential Health Plans, where I became the audit director. Subsequently moved to into the controller's role, which was a great learning experience for me, about 18 months, because that obviously made me much more empathetic when I came back in auditing, because I understood what it was like to be an auditee. And sort of a funny story, when I became the controller, I was then responsible for remediating some of the issues I had reported when I was the audit director. And my joke is, boy, these are dumb recommendations. Why would anybody have made these? So it really did add a different perspective. And the other thing I guess I would add is that the experience at Penny's was very diverse. It was much more than just retail stores at that time. They had drugstore operations. They had a lot of specialty operations. And I was actually, my last several years at Penny's in Dallas, managing the audit function at their life insurance company. So it was that insurance background that prepared me to move into the HMO world, even though healthcare was a little bit different. It was still insurance. And then in 1999, so 22 years ago, I had the opportunity to move across town here in Chicago from that organization to the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association as the chief auditor, vice president, chief auditor, and compliance officer. And again, when I got here in '99, it was myself and a staff of 3. And today we're at about 30. We can get into some of the details, but of that 30, only 10 are my audit staff. The rest are some folks that help me with compliance, but the bulk of the group is a function that I started in 2000 that we refer to as our National Anti-Fraud Department. And that helps support each of the independent Blue Cross Blue Shield plans in the fight against healthcare fraud, where billions and billions of dollars a year in fraudulent claims are submitted to insurance companies, which has not only a monetary impact, because those costs are ultimately passed on to consumers, but a lot of this fraud really does serious harm to people's health, their lives, right? Services that should have been rendered that weren't, services that weren't necessary that are performed just to be able to bill. And there's some really bad stories that come out of the fraud world. So we're really dedicated to trying to protect, our members collectively. And so whereas we have a typical audit staff in terms of backgrounds, most of my fraud staff have law enforcement backgrounds, federal law enforcement, particularly in the healthcare field, as well as clinicians. So it's a pretty specialized group. And those stories, we could talk about maybe some other time, because they're pretty entertaining.
Yeah, no, because I remember as you were talking about that, I mean, because especially in the insurance industry, insurance fraud is huge, right? And like you said, either billing for services that were never actually performed, or like you said, the scary thing when doctors or people are doing things that don't need to be done. I remember an old documentary I saw about sweaty palm syndrome. I don't know if you experienced this, right?
Yeah, we were very involved in that. And that case is a textbook example of people whose lives were ruined.
Yeah.
And, very quickly, sweaty palm, it sounds funny. It is actually a real disease, but it's extremely rare. And that's where your hands sweat so much that it really impacts your quality of life, right? You can't hold things.
Can't touch anything, yeah.
And it's a very complicated procedure to fix that. You actually have to deflate a lung and do some things. And the problem is that when you actually don't have sweaty palm, your body naturally reacts. So once they've changed your palms from releasing sweat, you now start to sweat from other parts of your body you're not really supposed to. And so it really had some bad effects on people, many people actually, in addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars that went into that. So that's just one example, but it's a very good example of the kind of things that a lot of people maybe aren't always familiar with.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to kind of, I always like to kind of recap a little bit too, because I think, as you talked about your career, I see interesting parallels, right, with most of the successful CAEs that I talk to, that I interview here, with my own career as well, to where a lot of times people, they're like, well, how do you get there?
Right.
And a lot of times there, sometimes people are afraid, oh, well, if I leave audit, then I'll never be able to come back. Well, again, there's an example. You left audit, you were a controller, you came back, and I've seen, and it sounds like this has been your experience too, is actually having some of that outside audit experience now makes you a better chief audit executive, right?
Oh, it absolutely does. Not only from just from a knowledge standpoint, but an empathy standpoint. Again,
Yeah.
I can much better relate to, operational roles because I've been in that role and I know what the time demands are like. And it's not easy. So clearly, I think the more experience that people can get, the better served that they are.
Yeah. Well, and again, too, it kind of depends on where you want to go, but it's always, to me, a little serendipitous too, as to how some of the experiences that we have, some of the jobs we do or the projects that we work on, doesn't, at first you don't really realize until years later probably why you did that and how it helped you get to where you're at, right? Like you said, I mean, you guys wanted to move back to Chicago, but the fact that Penny's at that time was such a diverse company that it had something like life insurance, you worked on life insurance, now you had that experience or exposure to that, and that opened the door to you then for being able to take the job with the HMO, you know, which
Yeah, no,
again is interesting because a lot of times people are like, well, no, I don't want to go do that project, but it's like, well, hold on just a minute, it's probably going to benefit you later on in your career.
yeah, and the reality is, when I started my career, probably when you started your career as well, many companies had much more. There were many more levels to the organization, and even as a staff auditor, there was a sort of a pre-designed stepping stone, right?
Mhm.
Staff auditor one, staff auditor two, and things are a lot flatter today. And in many organizations, there may not be a promotional opportunity, but there's an opportunity to even move laterally. And
Mhm.
to your point, sometimes we have to convince people that they need to look at the long term, that lateral experience that they would get will provide the opportunity for greater things in the future. And I think, again, in today's economy, those opportunities are going to be more frequent, perhaps, than a true promotion opportunity. But those will come as well.
Yeah. Well, and especially because, like you said, I mean, the last, especially 10 years, but probably even 20 years, the makeup too, right, of the audit department
Sure.
is changing. I mean, you've probably seen that as well. I know you said you've got 30 people, but only 10 of them are actually auditors. And I'm guessing too that even the people that are, your 10 core auditors, they don't necessarily have the same cookie cutter background that they did, when you and I started our career a long time ago. I mean, it was always everybody in audit, ex CPA, big four, it was big eight at the time, right?
Right.
But that had gone through that and then moved into internal audit, where now it's a lot different, right? I mean, like you said, you've got people from law enforcement, other kinds of backgrounds, that the audit groups are much more diverse than they were before.
Yeah, and again, now to a certain extent, I'm actually fortunate with my internal audit, the 10 that I mentioned, because actually it's a very experienced group. In fact, 6 of the folks actually have more professional experience than I have, if you can believe that.
Oh, wow.
So with that, there's pluses and minuses. The pluses are that they can work independently, and we are very productive with those 10 because they don't need a lot of handholding. The challenge, though, becomes succession planning and talent development for the future, right? So, which is a big, when you think about internal audit functions today, that's usually in the top 5, at least, of everyone's risks, at least their own management risks, is where's the rest of my future audit staff going to come from? And how do I get the people that are maybe more junior ready to move up into those next roles?
Yeah.
So again, maybe a topic to touch on later.
Well, I know that's like, we could do a whole nother episode on the succession planning, and especially with a lot of the generational things,
Hmm.
that we're dealing now with a big group of baby boomers. Are they going to leave the market? Are they not? When are they going to leave? Based on the last year, are they going to stay a little bit longer? Or there's been a lot of people that are like, screw it, I'm packing it up now, I'm done,
Right.
right? That a lot of people have done. So it's yeah, that's a whole other topic we can go down to, but we probably don't have time for that all of that today. But I wanted to bring up too, because I know one of the things, and I know as we were talking before, you get asked this a lot too. You have dual reporting relationships. I had dual reporting relationships, right? And there's some people that are, purists that are like, no, you cannot have any other role in the organization other than internal audit. But, like you'd said to me before, a lot of people in your industry do. I've seen a lot of people with mid-tier size companies that have multiple reporting relationships. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because you've had this now. It sounds like the whole time you've been.
Yes, it's grown, but yeah, so 25, or excuse me, 22, almost 22 years now, yeah, in that dual role. And clearly we're very much a department that closely adheres to IIA professional standards. And the IIA standards do allow for these types of relationships. So again, I've got responsibility for internal audit and compliance specifically. Now, a couple things in my definition in our world, from a compliance standpoint, it's not operational compliance that I've got accountabilities for. That would be maybe a little bit more challenging, but it's really our internal ethics environment. It's the training of our employees. It's the management of our code of conduct, the helpline, our conflict of interest process, the investigation of any allegations that may come up. And so it's a little bit different. And the key, first of all, is being very transparent about what our role is and what it's not. And so my internal audit department charter, for instance, is very specific, lays out what I do as the auditor, lays out what I do as the compliance officer. And similarly, our finance and audit committee charter, it lays out the accountabilities that they have to oversee my function as well. So first of all, you have to make sure that your audit committee and your governing board is on board and supportive, and also aware of and comfortable with the sort of safeguards that we put into place. So as an example, every once in a while, it makes sense to have our compliance function reviewed just to see if it could be doing, a better job. We've actually got a review of that type schedule for this year. Now, it will be done by some of my auditors. However, they're not the auditors that would work on compliance issues. And rather than have the report issued directly to me as the business owner, we'll have it issued to our general counsel to provide a little bit of independence. I also put into place things like I've got accountability to review any allegations that come up about any employees. However, and we use a third-party vendor to filter that and to make it anonymous. Well, if myself or anybody in my reporting chain was the subject of one of those allegations, it would automatically get routed to our general counsel. Yep. And he could determine, the best course of action rather than risking it coming to me and the perception being created that I, would sweep something under the rug. Same with our conflict of interest forms, which we ask people to do every year. I approve everybody in the company except my own team, and those again go to the general counsel. So, we're very aware of that. We put those kind of measures in place. And actually, when I do a lot of speaking, I've talked about the real importance of internal audit functions linking or partnering with their compliance function if they have one in their company, if they're not responsible for it, because I have found it to be very beneficial just from an internal audit standpoint to have my finger on the pulse of what kind of issues are being raised. Are there compliance concerns, particularly in an area that we're about to go do an audit in? Mm-hmm. That could be really disadvantageous.
That's a word, sure.
Right, disadvantageous. If that scenario occurs and you're working at cross purposes and you don't necessarily realize it, and so compliance by its nature is always sensitive to protecting information, but I'm always of the opinion that, an internal audit department to be successful has to really partner with HR, legal, and compliance, because those are the three areas that usually keep information most closely to the vest. And while there's a reason for that, there's also benefits to having internal audit part of those discussions. And I think it's more efficient that way.
Well, I think, what you just described there is great, right? Because again, it works for your organization. You've got the transparency there. You've got the checks and balances so that again, and I love what you just said too, because I've seen this, in my experience and others as well. You got to have that good relationship with HR, with legal, and with compliance, because really, you add internal audit to that. Those are really kind of like four key functions within the organization that are always should be working somewhat symbiotic, right? Yeah. Because if something comes up legally, you should probably know about it. A lot of times things that we're investigating or doing may have an HR component to it, right? And so having that relationship with those people makes a huge difference in your ability to be successful. If you're fighting with those people, if you don't get along with them, you're probably having a harder time, right, than you need to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they can be real key allies for you as well, too.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's again, what works for your organization.
Absolutely.
Because that was, my situation where it's like, okay, Jason, we want you to take on compliance. We want you to take on risk management. Okay, great. Do you understand, right? The transparency. Do you understand, right, what that means? I won't be auditing those areas. And again, the executives and the board were like, that's cool. We'd rather have somebody responsible for it and doing something about it than not having anything, right? And
Absolutely. And I know some of my peers that have maybe even a little bit more unusual roles. I know one chief auditor that's got responsibility for information security, which again is unusual. So that's clearly a case where that person brings in, hires, or has hired third-party vendors to independently audit that piece, right? And again, transparency is the key there.
well, and it's interesting because it's that's one that I actually had too.
Well, there you go.
Well, and the interesting thing was because when I was doing research, I don't know if the numbers are still the same, but we knew information security was reporting to our CIO, which is always kind of a tenuous thing, right? So the CFO said, okay, do some research, find out other than CIO, where does information security report in other organizations? And it came back the number 2 place was the CFO, the number 3 place was internal audit, which was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When I took those findings back to her, she said, well, I'm not doing it, so I guess you're doing it. So kind of interesting. Anyway, so this has all been great so far. So I did want to jump in a little bit, because I know you've been very active in the Institute of Internal Auditors for a long time. I mean, you were the chair, so maybe talk a little bit about that, because I know, as the chair and being on the board, you end up traveling all over the place, meeting people from all over the world. And internal audit is done differently in different places in the world as well. So maybe just kind of share a little bit, some of your experience with that, some of the things that you've kind of learned.
Sure, would love to. Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I actually, the same year I became a member, which was 1989, I became a volunteer, and I was still in Dallas at the time. So I was volunteering locally in Dallas and moved up through a number of the ranks there in Dallas. And one of the things that just a quick side note here, that I often talk about when I give talks, particularly about how auditors can maybe grow or develop in their career, is that if you can find the time, I'm telling you all very sincerely that my volunteer experience greatly helped my professional growth, because you get opportunities as a volunteer in many cases sooner than you would maybe in your professional environment. And you're now responsible for trying to convince people who don't work for you to work together and get some things done. And so you in many cases, you really have leadership opportunities that are, frankly, you can't really get anywhere else. So while it does take a commitment and take some time, I really highly encourage folks, particularly if they're maybe a little bit earlier in their careers, to seek out volunteer opportunities if you can, wherever you can, because you'll be better for it. Now, to your question, the other thing I guess I would add is that now, after 31 years of volunteering, both in Dallas and then moving to Chicago, and eventually I was the president of the Chicago chapter. I got involved in some international committees. I moved on to the North American board. I was the chair of the North American board in 2015, and ultimately moved up to the chairman of the board. I'm currently the immediate past chairman of the board. And I have built a lifetime's worth of friendships and networked colleagues based on that experience. And to your point, Jason, and maybe the thing that I treasure the most from this experience has been getting to know and traveling literally around the world, and seeing the challenges that internal audit face all around the world, in many cases in much more difficult circumstances and situations than maybe we're used to here in North America. There's some really courageous people doing some courageous things in countries, in organizations that are not only non-supportive of audit, but actually a little bit hostile. And there have been auditors even within the last year that have lost their lives because of issues they've raised. Now, I don't want to be over dramatic, but it was a real awakening for me to have that cultural experience. Unfortunately, my chairman year began in July of 2020 and effectively ended 6 months later when COVID hit.
Yep.
As a side note, my first meeting that I chaired as president of the Chicago chapter was the week of 9/11. And so people that were at that meeting associate me with 9/11. Now I'm the COVID chairman, so I'm pretty sure that I'll never get elected to any kind of volunteer position again. But I also was the first IA global chairman in their, I guess, 80 years that speaks Spanish. So because of that, I had the opportunity to do a lot of traveling and speaking in Latin, South America, Central America, in addition to places all around the world. And frankly, these are places I never would have been able to go probably in my professional career, in my personal career. So the travel was really a benefit. Yes, it's a lot of long hours. Yes, it's in addition to your normal workday. But I think just the development that you get and experience you get, as well as serving on a board as a board member, even if it's just in a local community organization, I think better prepared me and better prepared my colleagues to actually have to respond to their own boards in their professional environment. There was another board that I was on for a while where I was on their audit committee. So actually being an audit committee member made me much better, I think, person to staff our audit committee, right, as the chief auditor. And it was also a little fun to have the shoe on the other foot as well too. So any volunteer opportunities, while I certainly encourage involvement in professional organizations like the IA, there can be nonprofit volunteer organizations in your local town that could really benefit from the kind of skill set that an auditor has. Whether or not it's as simple as, putting in some basic internal controls into a little operation that really every dime counts, right? So again, I don't want to be on the soapbox, but I have found it to be extremely valuable to my professional development. And so if you can take advantage of it, I really encourage you to seek it out. And I know a lot of people are looking for volunteers and help.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great because again, like you said, as you're talking, because I was again going back to my early career, right,
Sure.
where I was on the board of some different nonprofits, some of which were because of the job that I had, right? Like we were a food manufacturing company. So guess what? Somebody from our company was always on the local food bank board, right? And so I was tasked to do that for a while. But they give you, like you said, the shoe is on the other foot, right? So now do I know what a board of directors deals with? Yes, because I've actually been on several boards of directors, right? And again, you would never really understand that, and you're interacting with with the board of your company, right, where you're working, if you didn't have some of that other experience. And again, a lot of times the people on there don't have our background, so we can actually be very beneficial to these other organizations. So yeah, volunteer at the IAA. If if you're passionate about dogs, let's say, well, maybe get on the Humane Society board or some kind of a thing like that, to where it gives you those other opportunities, especially earlier on in your career, that you normally wouldn't have just within your organization.
Yeah, and a little bit selfishly, if you're up for maybe a larger role in your organization and, against folks that have similar experiences to you, but you've got this volunteer experience or you've got demonstrated leadership experience outside, maybe that's the edge that, kicks you into the number one slot there. So it can't hurt.
Well, it can't hurt. And like you said, I mean, it forces, I'd never really thought of it in that way until you talked about it, because, I was a local chapter president, I was a district rep, kind of thing as well for the IA for many, many years. And a lot of the people that do volunteer at the local level are younger. I mean, they're
Sure.
seniors, maybe managers, but again, it gives you a responsibility or allows you to take a leadership role in that way, in working with people, learning how to work with people
Mhm.
before you're actually going to get it probably at your organization, which, like you said, if I'm looking at two different people and they're equally qualified, they've got similar experience, but this person also has some of that volunteer experience or, board or other stuff, they're probably going to float a little higher as well.
Yeah, and frankly, that also demonstrates good time management skills because particularly, when you're maybe in more senior levels, from a volunteer standpoint, it is very time consuming.
It is.
And, I was fortunate to be in organizations that did support that participation. I still had to get my own work done, but that clearly did help that there was encouragement, because I think there's intrinsic benefits to the organization as well that you bring back with you.
Yep, exactly. Well, yeah, no, I know, one of the ways that I always kind of like to wrap up a lot of these sessions, especially with somebody that's had as distinguished of a career as you have, is, I'm sure you've learned some stuff in your 30 plus years, right? So what, and I know for myself, I made some stupid mistakes when I was younger. Okay, but I learned from them. But what kind of advice do you give to people that are younger in their career? So maybe kind of we'll think of like two different kind of groups of people, right? And so your advice might be slightly different. But let's say, one person might be younger in their career, a new auditor, a senior auditor, somebody who's kind of newer at that point. So what kind of advice would you give to that person? The other one might be somebody who is maybe at a manager or a director level. They're not really a chief audit executive yet, but they have a desire to do that. So what kind of advice would you give to those people to help them get to that next level as well?
Well, I think that's a great question. So starting with the less experienced, perhaps more junior auditor, two things immediately jump into my mind. One is going to sound incredibly basic, but it has to do with making sure that you've got great attention to detail, because your credibility is very difficult to build back up once it's been blown, if you will. And I've seen instances where audit reports, otherwise very innocuous, had something that didn't add up, right? An actual mistake like that. And, you don't want either senior manager or worse yet, an audit committee member to call that out, because yes, it's a dumb mistake, but boy, everybody's going to have in the back of their mind the thought that, well, if something like this they missed, what else are they missing? And as silly as that sounds, I can't stress enough, attention to detail. The other thing probably goes for all levels, but it's important to realize from the beginning is that, particularly as an internal auditor, the one thing that you have and that you take with you in every job you have is your personal integrity. And auditors, in my view, are role models for the rest of the organization and how they should conduct themselves. And if, other employees see that the audit staff is maybe playing loose or goose with company policies or procedures, there will be no incentive for them to follow those procedures. And so, again, sounds basic, sounds silly, but always remember that people are watching you, even if you don't know it. And, the whole walking the walk, talking the talk thing, I really think, we have an obligation to do everything we can to demonstrate the importance of living our careers from a professional integrity standpoint. As you move up and you're in the manager role and you're looking to maybe move even further, that's where I think your communication skills and your knowledge of the business really are very important. Your ability to interact with more senior levels of the organization in a confident manner, in an informed manner, in a comfortable manner. Some of us like to do public speaking, others don't like it. And even getting up in front of maybe 20 people at a board meeting could give some people, cause for concern. So if that kind of communication isn't a strong suit, try to build that skill. There's a lot of local Toastmasters organizations. There's online training. There's seminars you can go to, because you do need to be comfortable in that kind of setting. And sometimes those settings, you can get asked tough questions. They're not trying to be mean, but they just have a legitimate reason to know. So that confidence, I think, does come a little bit with experience, but it can also be supplemented with developmental soft skills type of training. So having said all that, obviously the fundamentals, are sort of a given, right? I think there's things that you can teach to be a good auditor. There are things that are perhaps a little bit more inherent, right? And communication skills are certainly one of those things that I think makes you very successful. Um,
Well, no, and thanks for that, because that's again kind of what I've been seeing, but it seems like a lot of people still aren't kind of getting it. It's like we like to focus on a lot of our technical skills,
right.
becoming better technicians, but once you kind of get to that manager, director level, that's not what's going to get you ahead, right? Is it's the communication, it's being able to deal with other people effectively, because like you said, the difficult conversations, they come. In fact, the further you go up in the organization, the more difficult those conversations become.
That's
And
right.
so if you can't figure out and learn how to communicate, how to diffuse, how to lead people, in a way that you're comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations, then you're not going to get to that point, right? Or if you don't either want to learn it or you don't want to deal with it, then maybe stay at the manager or director level. Because I've also seen a lot of people who they get that next job and then they're like, oh man, I should have stayed at my other level. I don't like what I'm doing now.
No, and that's great. And there are people that are very happy and very good at their level, and that's great because that's we need that as well too. I've also seen people that, particularly if have just been promoted into their first people manager job, maybe they were excellent technicians, well qualified, but they've never managed people, and that's a skill as well too. And sometimes that can be rough at the beginning. So people need to be aware, self-aware, and be very open to coaching and mentoring on how to manage others. Again, particularly when those difficult conversations come up where you've got to coach somebody's performance up. And, maybe it's somebody that 6 months ago you were at the same level, your peers and colleagues. And now it's a little bit more awkward, right? So there's pluses and minuses. My dad used to say, it's great being a manager, except for the people. Right. So obviously he was joking, but there's a little bit of undercurrent there that is worth noting as well.
Yeah. Well, no, Mike, this has been fabulous. Hey, I really appreciate your time today, and know that people are going to get a lot of value from this. And you gave some great advice, for people there at the end too. That everybody's at different points in their career, right? But again, just kind of look at where do you want to go? What is it that you need to try to do? And yeah, the communication, the confidence, being able to deal with people is important at the manager level. I think it's even going to be more important further down as we move forward in kind of the way that work is changing, as well as the organizations become more flat. Like you and I have already seen in our careers, much flatter organizations now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate this opportunity as well. I have benefited so much from people who have helped me through my career, again, mentors, bosses. So I really, I could go on all day. But I would like just to add that I appreciate you making me feel more comfortable by sitting there wearing a jacket while I'm in Chicago, where it's probably a wrinkle of 0, and I've got 4-foot snowdrifts in my house. So thank you, for that effort.
Well, it's yeah, there's actually psychological reasons behind it. Well, we won't get into it today, right? But there is actually, because there's a lot more to some of the communication things too, with rapport building and other stuff. So yeah. I'm rugged up too. If I came in here in a tank top, you'd be like, "What the heck, Jason? Come on, man."
It's a casual Friday, is what I would say.
Exactly. Well, Mike, thanks, and like I said, might have to have you on in the future because there's a lot of other places we could end up going to. But I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Anytime, Jason. Thanks.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share with your friends and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know what you enjoyed the most about the podcast, and you may even be featured on a future episode. When you're ready to turbocharge your leadership development, join the Briefing Leadership Program, where you get access to everything in one place and can interact directly with me in the group. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy's video on-demand learning platform at ondemand.criskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you will also have access to hundreds of video-on-demand learning opportunities. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.